Sweat beaded on 3 dozen alien brows. Silence choked the rusted cantina, thick and metallic. The galaxy's most feared executioner had just kicked the primary blast doors off their heavily greased tracks. Every patron present prayed to their respective gods. Cole just snorted into his lukewarm synthetic beer and started giggling. Cole pressed his thumb against the side of his glass, feeling the slight vibration of the cantina's failing life support scrubbers humming through the cheap composite material. He rubbed the pad of his finger against the condensation, tracing a streak down to the scarred resin of the bar top. The air inside the way station smelled like a mixture of frying grease, oxidized copper, and the sharp, ammonia-laced sweat of the insectoid dock workers huddled in the booths behind him. It was a miserable smell, but it was familiar. It was the smell of a Tuesday at the edge of colonized space. His boots, heavy with magnetic plating and caked in gray palladium dust, ached against his bruised ankles. He shifted his weight on the unsteady bar stool, wincing as a sharp pain lanced up his lower back. 14 hours pulling slag in the asteroid belt left a man's spine feeling like a stack of cracked porcelain plates. He didn't want an adventure. He didn't want trouble. He just wanted to finish this violently overpriced, yeast-tasting beer, swallow 2 anti-inflammatories, and crawl into his sensory deprivation bunk. That was when the floor vibrated. It wasn't the rhythmic, rattling tremor of a heavy cargo freighter docking at the nearby pylons. It was a localized, heavy thud. A singular, deliberate impact that sent a ripple through the stagnant air of the room. The lo-fi synth music grinding out of the blown speakers in the corner died with a pathetic squeal, abruptly cut off by the bartender, a 6-armed, blue-scaled Tellurian named Jax, smashing a fleshy palm down on the master control console. The sudden absence of sound was worse than the terrible music. It left a vacuum that was immediately filled with the ragged, terrified breathing of 30 different species. Cole didn't turn around immediately. He kept his eyes on his glass, watching a single bubble detach from the bottom and lazily float to the amber surface. He could smell it before he heard the second footstep, the sudden, overwhelming stench of sulfur, wet ash, and fresh blood. It washed over the cheap grease and ammonia, a predatory musk that triggered millions of years of prey instinct in the alien patrons around him. To Cole, it just smelled like a malfunctioning incinerator. Behind him, the heavy Durasteel blast doors, designed to withstand a micrometeorite strike, groaned. Then, with a horrific screech of tearing metal, they buckled inward and slammed onto the stained deck plating. A collective, choked gasp sucked the oxygen out of the room. Cole finally swiveled on his stool, the rusted bearings squeaking loudly in the oppressive quiet. Standing in the ruined doorway was a nightmare given physical form. It was a Varkul, though that sterile classification hardly did it justice. It stood over 8 feet tall, a hulking mountain of jagged charcoal-gray chitin and pulsating bioluminescent veins that glowed a sickly radioactive green. Thermal optic camouflage plating on its broad shoulders crackled and sparked, shorting out as the creature abandoned stealth for sheer, blunt force intimidation. In its lower left manipulator claw, it dragged a kinetic blade the size of a human surfboard. The edge of the weapon dug a smoking trench into the deck, throwing a shower of bright orange sparks against the creature's armored shins. The cantina froze. It was a literal, physiological paralysis. To Cole's left, a pair of amphibious merchants locked their gills shut, their chromatic skin flashing rapidly from a vibrant turquoise to a dead, ashen gray as their bodies flooded with terror-induced paralysis. Across the room, an avian smuggler dropped his glass. It shattered on the floor, the sound mimicking a gunshot, but the smuggler didn't even flinch. His hollow bones locked in place, eyes dilated until they were pools of absolute black. The fear pheromones in the air were so thick Cole could almost taste them on his tongue, a bitter, sour milk tang that coated the back of his throat. The universe had a healthy respect for the Varkul. They were apex predators from a high-gravity world with an atmosphere composed mostly of toxic acid. They didn't just kill, they dismantled. They were the bogeymen that alien parents used to frighten their offspring into obedience. This one had a reputation. Cole had seen the blurry Holonet feeds. They called it the Butcher of CSEC. The creature took a slow, agonizingly deliberate step forward. It breathed, and the sound was a wet, rasping gargle, like air being forced through crushed glass and thick mud. It paused, letting its glowing, multifaceted eyes sweep over the terrified patrons. It was soaking it in, basking in the absolute, unquestioned dominion it held over the room. Cole rested his elbows on his knees, leaning forward slightly. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble on his jawline and the deep, exhausted bags under his eyes. He felt a sneeze threatening to build in the bridge of his nose, likely triggered by the sulphurous smoke drifting off the creature's armor. He sniffed loudly, wiping his nose with the back of a filthy canvas sleeve. The mundane sound of his sniff echoed off the metal bulkheads. The Varkul's heavy, armored head snapped toward Cole. The creature didn't rush. It turned its massive frame with a theatrical, calculated slowness, the heavy armor plates grinding together like tectonic shifts. It raised its kinetic blade an inch, letting it hover just above the deck, the micro-vibrations humming a low, lethal tune. Cole stared back. He didn't feel the icy grip of primal terror. He didn't feel his heart hammer a frantic rhythm of fight or flight against his ribs. Instead, he felt a strange, bubbling pressure in his chest. A bizarre, contradictory tightening of his diaphragm. The Varkul flared its mandibles, revealing rows of serrated obsidian teeth dripping with thick black saliva. It let out a low, subsonic rumble that rattled the glass on the bar top. It was the ultimate display of dominance, a biological imperative demanding submission. Cole bit the inside of his cheek, hard. He tasted the sharp tang of copper. He squeezed his eyes shut for a fraction of a second, his shoulders trembling. The trembling wasn't from fear. Cole was trying desperately to hold it in. His brain, exhausted and starved of proper rest, was malfunctioning. Under the crushing weight of a 14-hour shift, an aching spine, and a deep-seated, cynical exhaustion with the universe, his psychological defenses had short-circuited. The Varkul wasn't terrifying. It was absurd. It was an over-designed, try-hard, walking cliché from a bad pulp vid. The jagged spikes, the glowing green veins, the theatrical dragging of the sword, it was just too much. The creature took another step, closing the distance to the bar. As it did, its massive clawed foot came down on a discarded, half-eaten protein puck left on the floor by a previous patron. There was a distinct, cartoonish squelch. The terrifying apex predator, the Butcher of CSEC, slid exactly half an inch to the left, its heavy kinetic blade wobbling slightly as the creature instinctively threw out an arm to catch its balance. It recovered instantly, snapping back into its menacing posture. But the damage was done. A sharp, undignified snort blasted out of Cole's nose. He clamped a dirt-stained hand over his mouth, his eyes watering. But the pressure had breached the hull. The sheer, unadulterated ridiculousness of existence, of being a squishy, sleep-deprived primate from a mudball watching a bio-armored nightmare slip on space junk was too much. A chuckle slipped through his fingers. It sounded broken and raspy in the dead silence of the cantina. The Varkul froze. Its mandibles twitched in genuine confusion. The multifaceted eyes narrowed, attempting to process the auditory input. In its long, bloody career, it had heard weeping, begging, screaming, and the wet, choking sounds of death. It had never heard this. Cole's chest heaved. He let out a wheezing gasp, pulling his hand away from his face. I'm sorry, he choked out, his voice cracking. Oh my God. He bent over at the waist, resting his forehead against the cold resin of the bar top, and let it go. It was not a heroic laugh. It wasn't the defiant sneer of a grizzled space marine facing down the enemy. It was an ugly, guttural, chest-tearing guffaw. It was the kind of laugh that hurts the ribs and leaves you gasping for oxygen. Cole pounded his fist weakly against the bar, tears streaming down his dust-caked cheeks, leaving pale tracks in the grime. The sword, Cole wheezed, pointing a shaking finger blindly behind him. You were dragging the fucking sword, like an anime villain. He threw his head back, howling with laughter. The sound bounced off the rusted bulkheads, chaotic and wild. It was a raw, primal expression of Earth, a death world where humor was the only coping mechanism left for a species that had spent millennia being eaten by lions, plagued by diseases, and bombing each other over imaginary lines. Cole was laughing at the Varkul, yes, but he was also laughing at his back pain, his empty bank account, and the utter stupidity of the galaxy. The alien patrons watched in a state of catatonic shock. To them, the human had snapped. His mind had broken under the terror, rendering him dangerously unpredictable. The blue-scaled bartender slowly, agonizingly slowly, lowered himself behind the counter, fully expecting the human to explode in a shower of bioweaponized madness. The Varkul, however, was experiencing a profound and unsettling sensation. The creature took a half-step back, its heavy kinetic blade lowering until the tip rested harmlessly against the floor. It didn't understand. Where were the chemical markers of terror? The human sweat didn't smell of fear. It smelled of salt, exhaustion, and mild amusement. The creature's thermal sensors, picking up Cole's heat signature, showed a bizarre fluctuation, not the cold, restrictive shrinking of capillaries found in terrified prey, but a warm, flushed expansion. I can't breathe, Cole gasped, sliding off the bar stool. His knees wobbled, and he had to grab the edge of the bar to keep from collapsing onto the sticky deck. He looked up at the towering monstrosity, wiping tears from his eyes with his thumbs. You slipped. You came in here, kicking down doors, and you stepped on a space muffin. He started giggling again, a high-pitched, breathless sound that made the amphibian merchants in the corner shudder in horror. The Varkul rumbled, a sound that was significantly less confident than before. It took another step backward. This human was defective. This human was an anomaly. Predators rely on the predictable behavior of prey to maintain control. When the prey stops acting like prey, the entire dynamic collapses into unpredictable chaos. Look at you, Cole breathed, finally managing to suck in a solid lungful of recycled air. He leaned heavily against the bar, a wide, slightly deranged smile plastered across his face. He felt lighter. The crushing weight of the day had evaporated, replaced by a reckless, adrenaline-fueled euphoria. You've got glowing green tubes. Why? What possible evolutionary advantage is glowing in the dark? You look like a gaming PC from the early 2000s. The Varkul didn't know what a gaming PC was, but the tone of the vocalization was unmistakable. It was mockery. The creature raised its blade again, attempting to recapture the lost momentum of the room. It let out a roar, a deafening blast of sound meant to shatter eardrums and break resolve. Cole just smiled wider, showing teeth stained with cheap coffee and cheaper beer. He didn't flinch. The roar washed over him, blowing his unkempt hair back from his forehead, but the fear center of his brain refused to engage. He had crossed the threshold of terror and found the absurdity on the other side. Do it again, Cole challenged, his voice dropping into a raspy, quiet dare that carried effortlessly across the silent room. Squeak for me. The Varkul's glowing veins pulsed erratically. It looked from Cole to the terrified aliens, then back to the laughing, broken human who refused to play by the rules of the universe. For the first time in its long, violent life, the Butcher of Sisek felt the cold, creeping sensation of uncertainty. Saliva, thick and highly acidic, dripped from the Varkul's lower mandibles and struck the deck plating with a sharp hiss. A tiny plume of acrid white smoke curled upward, carrying the scent of melting synthetic rubber. The creature stood rigid, its massive frame locked in a posture of aggressive uncertainty. Its thermal optic camouflage continued to glitch, throwing random, jagged patches of localized invisibility across its left shoulder, making the arm look as though it were being actively digested by the air itself. Cole finally pushed himself fully off the bar stool. His heavy magnetic boots clamped onto the floor with a dull, resonant thud. He swayed for a fraction of a second, his equilibrium completely shot by a combination of adrenaline, sleep deprivation, and the 2 pints of heavily watered-down synthetic ethanol currently sloshing in his stomach. He dragged a dirt-stained palm down his face, feeling the rough, coarse grit of asteroid dust scratching against his skin. His cheekbones ached. His ribs ached. Even the roots of his hair felt like they were throbbing. "You," Cole rasped, pointing a calloused finger at the towering beast. He had to pause, taking a sharp, shallow breath to suppress a lingering hiccup of laughter. "You have no idea how stupid you look right now." The translation matrix embedded in the Varkul's neural cortex struggled with the human vernacular, but the intent was crystal clear. It was a direct, unfiltered challenge. The creature let out a sequence of rapid, staccato clicks from its throat, a sound resembling rocks being ground in a heavy industrial crusher. It tightened its grip on the kinetic blade. The micro-vibrations of the weapon intensified, emitting a high-pitched whine that set Cole's molars vibrating in his gums. Cole didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't have one. He didn't widen his stance or ball his fists into defensive striking postures. Instead, he unbuttoned the top clasp of his grease-stained work collar, exposing his pale, sweat-slicked neck to the stagnant air of the cantina. He rubbed the back of his neck, wincing as the inflamed muscles screamed in protest. "I've been awake for 31 hours, Cole said. His voice wasn't a booming declaration. It was a flat, exhausted drone. It was the voice of a man explaining a delayed shipment to a mid-level manager. "I spent the first 14 hours pulling iron slag out of a rock, moving at 40,000 miles an hour. I spent the next 10 fixing a faulty plasma vent that kept trying to cook my left leg. The rest of the time, I've been sitting here, trying to convince myself that this horrible, yeast-flavored piss is actually beer." The Varkul took a slow, grinding step forward. The heavy armor plates covering its chest flared outward, a biological threat display meant to make it appear even larger. The sickly green glow of its bioluminescent veins pulsed faster, casting long, warped shadows across the terrified alien patrons huddled in the booths. To Cole's right, a six-eyed insectoid let out a high, keening whine of absolute terror, a sound that immediately died as the Varkul snapped its massive head in that direction. Cole stepped into the creature's line of sight, blocking its view of the cowering alien. "Hey," Cole snapped, snapping his fingers. The sound was sharp, brittle, and infinitely tiny in the face of the towering apex predator. "Look at me. I'm talking to you." The Varkul's multifaceted eyes refocused on the human. The creature's pheromone receptors were working in overdrive, sampling the air molecules around Cole's body. It was searching for the distinct, sharp chemical signature of cortisol, of adrenaline, of the blind panic that precedes a slaughter. It found nothing but the stale stench of oxidized copper, old sweat, and a profound, overwhelming apathy. "You want to be scary?" Cole asked, gesturing lazily toward the massive kinetic blade. "That thing? The glowing armor? Kicking down doors? That's not scary. That's theater. You're a performer." Cole took a step closer. He was entirely out of his mind, driven by a bizarre cocktail of physical exhaustion and the deep, inherent nihilism of his species. He stopped just 3 feet from the tip of the kinetic blade. He could feel the heat radiating off the vibrating metal, a dry, oppressive warmth that smelled heavily of ozone and scorched oxygen. "You want to know what's actually scary?" Cole lowered his voice, the raspy timbre cutting through the suffocating silence of the room. He stared directly into the central cluster of the Varkul's eyes. "Scary is a microfracture in your oxygen line when you're 3 days away from the nearest medical station. Scary is watching your bank account drain while your orbital hab rent goes up 30%. Scary is waking up and realizing you have to do the exact same miserable, back-breaking thing for the next 40 years just to afford the privilege of not starving to death." The Varkul remained perfectly still. The menacing clicking in its throat had stopped. You, Cole scoffed, a bitter, humorless smile touching the corners of his chapped lips. You're just a sudden stop at the end of a long, bad joke. You're a release clause. If you're going to use that oversized butter knife, then do it. Chop me in half, please. I could use the sleep. He spread his arms, a slow, lazy gesture of complete surrender. He didn't close his eyes. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, breathing in the scent of wet ash and waiting for the punchline. The silence in the way station dragged out, thick and suffocating, stretching like an over-torqued cable about to snap. Every patron in the room, from the amphibious merchants to the avian smuggler, watched the human with a mixture of profound awe and sickening horror. In the history of the frontier colonies, no one had ever spoken to a Varkul executioner. You ran, you hid, or you died screaming. You didn't complain to them about your rent. The butcher of C-Sec twitched. The massive muscles in its right arm bunched, the charcoal gray chitin shifting as the creature finally reacted. With a sudden, violent burst of kinetic energy, the Varkul swung the massive blade. It was a horizontal cleave, aimed directly at Cole's neck. The weapon tore through the air, displacing the atmospheric pressure with a concussive whump that popped the eardrums of the insectoid dockworkers behind the bar. The edge of the blade was a blur of orange heat and microscopic vibrations, a weapon designed to shear through heavy starship bulkheads as easily as wet paper. Cole's biological reflexes betrayed him. He couldn't help it. Millions of years of mammalian survival instinct demanded a reaction. He flinched. His shoulders jumped. His eyes squeezed shut for a fraction of a second, and he let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. The blade stopped. The heat radiating from the vibrating metal was immense. Cole opened his eyes. The edge of the kinetic blade was hovering exactly half an inch from his left carotid artery. He could feel the fine, dust-coated hairs on his neck curling and crisping from the sheer temperature of the weapon. The smell of burning hair joined the already foul mixture of odors in the cantina. The micro-vibrations of the blade hummed a deadly, localized song right against his jawline. Cole stood frozen, his eyes locked on the glowing orange edge of the sword. His heart was hammering against his ribs now, a heavy, frantic rhythm that pounded in his temples. He was afraid. Physically, biologically afraid. But his mind, his exhausted, cynical, battered mind, refused to catch up to his body. He didn't scream. He didn't drop to his knees and beg. Instead, Cole let out a long, shuddering sigh. It was the sound of a man who had just watched his last transport shuttle leave the docking bay without him. He slowly reached up, his hand shaking slightly, and pushed the flat of the massive blade away from his neck. The metal was hot to the touch, burning the calluses on his fingers, but he didn't pull away. He just pushed it back an inch. "Do it, or don't," Cole muttered, his voice hoarse. He dropped his hand back to his side. "But stop playing with it. You're giving me a headache." The Varkul stared at the human. The creature's biological processors were locked in a severe cognitive loop. It was a predator, an apex killer bred for the hunt. The entire foundation of its existence was built on the transfer of power through fear. The hunt was a sacred equation. The predator initiates, the prey panics, the predator consumes. But this human had broken the equation. There was no hunt here. There was no chase, no terror, no submission. There was only a deeply damaged, apathetic creature offering its own throat with the casual indifference of someone throwing out the garbage. To kill this human wouldn't be an execution. It wouldn't be a victory. It would be a chore. It would be an act of mundane waste disposal, entirely devoid of the honor and terror the Varkul craved. The creature's mandibles parted, letting out a low, hissing exhale that smelled of sulfur and rotting meat. The glowing green veins on its armor dimmed slightly, the sickly light fading into a dull, pulsing throb. Slowly, deliberately, the Varkul lowered the kinetic blade. The humming died down as the creature deactivated the micro-vibrators, plunging the cantina back into the heavy, ringing silence. It took a step back, the heavy chitin plates grinding. Then it took another. It didn't take its eyes off Cole. It looked at the human not with the predatory hunger it had entered with, but with a profound, almost superstitious revulsion. Cole was an anomaly, a disease-broken thing that didn't adhere to the laws of nature. The Varkul turned. It didn't rush. It maintained its imposing, heavy stride, but the theatricality was gone. It marched back toward the ruined blast doors, its heavy footfalls crushing the rusted debris of the entrance. It stepped out into the docking bay corridor, its massive frame swallowing the dim overhead light, and disappeared into the shadows. Cole stood perfectly still for 10 long seconds, staring at the empty doorway. He listened to the heavy, rhythmic thumping of the creature's footsteps, fading into the distance. His knees suddenly buckled. He grabbed the edge of the bar with both hands, his knuckles turning white as he caught his own weight. His chest heaved as his body finally processed the massive dump of adrenaline. He was shaking violently, his teeth chattering in his skull. The cold sweat broke out across his forehead, stinging his eyes. Behind the bar, Jax, the blue-scaled Tellurian bartender, slowly peeked his head over the counter. His 6 arms were trembling, gripping the edge of the resin top. The rest of the cantina slowly began to unfreeze. The amphibian merchants gasped for air, their gills flaring wildly as their chromatic skins slowly shifted back from ashen gray to a sickly, stressed turquoise. Cole dragged himself back onto his bar stool. The rusted bearings squeaked loudly. He leaned his elbows on the bar, burying his face in his hands, taking long, ragged breaths. "Jax," Cole croaked, his voice muffled by his palms. The bartender flinched, his blue scales rippling. "Yes, Cole?" Cole lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed, the bags under them looking bruised and dark in the harsh lighting. He pointed a trembling finger at the half-empty glass of lukewarm synthetic beer sitting on the scratched resin. "Hit me with a shot of the industrial solvent you keep under the counter," Cole said, his voice flat, "and put it on my tab. If you enjoyed this raw dive into human absurdity and Deathworlder grit, don't forget to leave a like and share the story with your fellow sci-fi junkies. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss out on the next chapter of HFY madness. What would you do if a galactic assassin kicked down your door? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, keep surviving the stars.